Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've spent the last 3 years working as a system administrator at Megatech Equipment Manufacturing. The pay is decent, and the job isn't bad, but half the time I'm dealing with office politics instead of fixing real tech problems. My day starts at 8 a.m. when I unlock the server room and run through my morning checklist. By 9, I'm usually settled at my desk in the admin area, a glass-walled section of the third floor that houses me and the two other system administrators for the company. We maintain all the network infrastructure, email servers, and printing systems. The database administrators have their own section next door. We get along well enough, though there's always been a bit of professional rivalry between our departments. Last Tuesday started like any other. I was troubleshooting a network connectivity issue for the accounting department when I heard the unmistakable sound of angry footsteps storming down the hallway. The glass door to our section flew open so hard I thought it might shatter. There stood one of the sales guys from the 5th floor. I'd seen him around before, always wearing expensive suits and talking loudly on his phone in the elevator. He had that slick, overly confident look that most of our top salespeople had. He immediately started shouting about where his report was and why it was imprinting. I looked up, already used to these types of interruptions. I greeted him and asked what the problem was. He angrily explained that he'd been waiting 20 minutes for his quarterly sales report to print, and nothing was coming out of the printer. He added that he had a meeting with the regional director in 10 minutes, his voice getting increasingly agitated. I told him I would check the print queue for him. I pulled up the spooler on my screen and immediately saw the issue. There was a massive 140 megabyte print job clog in the queue. In the days of text-based reports, this was practically a novel. Thousands and thousands of pages that would take hours to print. I explained to him that I had found the problem. There was a huge print job ahead of his that was blocking everything, and it was about 140 megabytes, which would equal thousands of pages. The salesman leaned over my shoulder, his expensive cologne nearly choking me. He told me that it must be the database report he started earlier. He then ordered me to just kill it, emphasizing that he needed his quarterly report immediately. I asked if he was sure, pointing out that it was a lot of data he was asking me to delete. He insisted, saying yes and repeating his demand to kill it, claiming this other report was more important. I shrugged and deleted the huge print job from the queue, telling him it wasn't my data or my problem if he wanted it gone. I told him that his report should start printing now. He rudely commented that finally someone around here could do their job, then stormed out without a thank you. I went back to my network troubleshooting, thinking that was it. About 10 minutes later, the glass door slammed open again. The same salesman was back, looking even angrier than before. He demanded to know where his report was, the one he was printing earlier, the big one. I looked up from my screen, confused. I reminded him that he told me to kill it, so that's what I did. The salesman became indignant, claiming he didn't mean that report but whatever else was in the queue. I explained that he had pointed at the screen and told me to kill the 140 megabyte job, and asked if he thought I would delete someone else's print job just because he said so. The salesman demanded that I fix it and get his report back. I explained that I couldn't just get it back and that once it's deleted from the queue, it's gone. I advised him he would need to run the query again. He became more agitated, calling the situation ridiculous and telling me to do my job. This guy was really starting to annoy me. I decided to look deeper into what exactly he'd been trying to print. Every computer in the building had keyboard logging software installed, company policy that was disclosed in the employee handbook, though most people forgot about it. I pulled up his logs and examined the SQL query he'd run. I told him that, according to his keyboard logs, he was trying to print every single sale made by every person in the company for the past 5 years, which explained why the file was so massive. The salesman froze for a moment. He accusingly asked if I was spying on him. I clarified that it was standard company logging, disclosed in his employment contract. I then questioned why he was trying to print such a massive report. He became defensive, saying it was none of my business and again demanding that I fix it. I explained that, as a system administrator, I didn't have access to modify or run queries on the Oracle database, and suggested he would need to see one of the database administrators next door. He declared this was unacceptable and threatened to speak to my supervisor before storming out again. I shook my head and sent a quick message to the lead database administrator, letting her know what had happened and that an angry salesman might be heading her way. About an hour later, my phone rang. It was the lead database administrator. She asked why that salesman had command line access to their production database, noting that only DBAs and developers should have that kind of access. I told her I had no idea and that it wasn't something my department would have set up. I pulled up the keyboard logs again and looked more carefully at the login information the salesman had used. I shared the interesting discovery that he was logged in using the credentials for that database administrator who left the company 3 months ago, the one who moved to Seattle. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The DBA expressed shock, saying those credentials should have been revoked immediately and that this was a massive security breach. Within 30 minutes, the account was killed and security was escorting the salesman out of the building, carrying a cardboard box with his personal items. Turns out he'd been using the former DBA's login to run unauthorized reports on other salespeople's numbers, trying to figure out their client lists and strategies. 2 days later, I received a formal thank you email from the head of sales. Apparently, the salesman had been poaching clients from other sales representatives for months, and no one could figure out how he was identifying which clients to target. Sometimes being a system administrator means being the bad guy who says no. Other times it means being the person who accidentally uncovers corporate espionage just by doing your job. Either way, I was just happy I didn't have to deal with that particular salesman ever again. Hard work runs in our family. My parents spent 30 years running the local hardware store in our small town, and I grew up learning the value of earning your own way. That's why when my 10-year-old daughter and 8-year-old son asked to set up a lemonade stand over summer break, I was all for it. We live in a nice neighborhood with plenty of foot traffic, especially on weekends when people head to the community park just down the street. My wife and I helped the kids build a cute little stand from some spare wood I had in the garage. We painted it yellow and my daughter decorated it with hand-drawn lemons. They spent an entire evening perfecting their lemonade recipe, just the right amount of sugar and fresh squeezed lemons, with a hint of mint from our garden. Their first weekend was a huge success. They made almost $40, which was pretty impressive for a couple of kids selling lemonade at 50 cents a cup. My daughter handled the money while my son was in charge of pouring. My wife supervised, of course, sitting on our front lawn under the shade of a tree. The trouble started on their second weekend. Apparently, our next-door neighbor's kids had the same idea and set up their own drink stand across the street. Nothing wrong with a little friendly competition, right? Well, that's what I thought. By midday, it was clear that our kids' stand was doing much better business. My wife texted me at work with updates, saying people were actually walking past the neighbor's stand to come to ours. I got home from work early that day, around 2 p.m., wanting to see my little entrepreneurs in action. I parked down the street and was walking toward our house when I heard shouting. When I got closer, I saw a woman standing in front of our lemonade stand, gesturing wildly. The woman was yelling that it was completely unfair. She complained that her kids had been out all morning and nobody was buying their lemonade because she thought we were somehow cheating. My wife asked her what she meant, questioning how children could possibly cheat at selling lemonade. The woman pointed at our setup and accused us of being too professional. She also claimed that our recipe must have included something special to make people choose our stand over her kids' stand. My wife explained that we just used fresh lemons and mint from our garden and said that was hardly cheating. I quickened my pace, not liking where this was going. The woman was red-faced and kept looking back at her kids' stand, which had no customers. The woman said she'd been watching us all day. She told us her kids were crying because no one wanted their lemonade and accused us of stealing their customers. My daughter defended us, saying we weren't stealing anybody and that people just liked our lemonade better. That seemed to set her off. Before anyone could react, she walked back to her van, yanked open the side door, and pulled out what I later realized was a fire extinguisher from her vehicle. I shouted, asking what she was doing, but she was already storming back toward our stand. In seconds, she had pulled the pin and was spraying the white foam all over our kids' lemonade stand. She screamed that she was eliminating the cheaters from this competition and that she was doing it for her children. My wife jumped in front of our kids trying to shield them but got a full blast in her face. My daughter, trying to protect the money box, also got sprayed directly. The foam was everywhere, all over the stand, the lemonade pitchers, my wife and daughter. My son ran toward me crying as I rushed to restrain this lunatic. I yelled for her to stop, asking if she was crazy and pointing out that there were children present. I managed to wrestle the extinguisher away from her and tossed it aside. My wife was coughing violently, and my daughter was crying, both covered in chemical foam. I could see my wife was having trouble breathing. The woman shouted that they deserved it, and that's what cheaters get. I called 911 immediately. My wife was still gasping for air, and my daughter's eyes were red and swollen from the chemicals. The paramedics arrived quickly and determined that both needed to go to the hospital, my wife for chemical inhalation and my daughter for chemical exposure to her eyes and skin. When they were loading them into the ambulance, the police arrived. The woman was still there, somehow believing she was justified in her actions. Several neighbors had witnessed everything and were already giving statements. The police officer asked the woman if she had deployed the fire extinguisher on these people. She admitted she had, but justified it by saying we were stealing her kids' customers and that it wasn't fair competition. The officer told her that she had just assaulted the woman and a child was a chemical agent, and instructed her to turn around and put her hands behind her back. They arrested her right there in front of everyone. I later found out she was charged with 2 counts of assault with a dangerous substance, child endangerment, and destruction of property. My wife and daughter were released from the hospital that evening. My wife had some respiratory irritation that took a few days to clear up. My daughter's eyes were sore for about a week. I made sure to follow up with the district attorney personally and provided all the medical reports. In the end, she pleaded guilty and got 18 months in prison plus restitution for all our medical bills and property damage. The kids set up their stand again the next month, and the whole neighborhood came out to support them. They made over $300 that weekend. 6 months ago, I found myself in a ridiculous dilemma. Keep my job or keep my sanity. I've been working at the same marketing firm for nearly 5 years. Good pay, interesting work, and what I thought was a decent workplace culture. Turns out, I was dead wrong. Everything changed when I slipped on some ice in the parking lot last winter and injured my back. The doctor diagnosed me with a herniated disc that was pressing on my sciatic nerve. If you've never experienced sciatica, count yourself lucky. It's this horrible shooting pain that goes from your lower back down through your leg. Sitting for long periods makes it exponentially worse. At first, I tried to tough it out. I'd bring special cushions to work, take frequent breaks to walk around, and pop painkillers like they were candy. But after a few weeks, it became clear that the 3-hour round-trip commute and sitting at my desk all day were making my condition deteriorate rapidly. My doctor wrote a letter recommending that I work from home at least 3 days a week to reduce the time spent sitting in a car and to allow me to use my standing desk sit-up at home. He explained that this would help manage the pain while I underwent physical therapy, potentially avoiding surgery altogether. I submitted the accommodation request to Human Resources, thinking it would be a no-brainer. I had already proven I could work effectively from home during the pandemic. My productivity numbers were actually higher when working remotely because I wasn't distracted by office noise and wasn't in constant pain. That's when my department head decided to make my life miserable. She called me into her office after receiving my accommodation request. She expressed concern about the work from home arrangement I was requesting. When I explained that my doctor thought it would help me avoid surgery if I could reduce time spent commuting and sitting in office chairs, she was dismissive. She claimed to understand I was in pain but suggested everyone has aches and pains. She questioned whether my back issue was severe enough to warrant special treatment. I tried to explain that this wasn't just an ache and that I had medical documentation showing nerve damage being aggravated by sitting for long periods. She responded by telling me she needed to consider the impact on the department. She claimed having me remote for 3 days would create an undue burden on the team because people needed face-to-face collaboration. An undue burden? I did the same work regardless of location, and most of our meetings were already hybrid with team members in different offices. The next day, she had the nerve to tell the accommodations officer that I was equally productive whether at home or in the office, but still insisted that 3 days of remote work was too much. They compromised at 2 days of remote work per week, but 2 days wasn't enough. The pain was getting worse, not better. I couldn't recover sufficiently between office days. My physical therapist was concerned about my deteriorating condition. And finally, my doctor said surgery was becoming inevitable if things didn't change. After a rough week where I could barely walk by Friday, I made the difficult decision to take medical leave for the surgery and recovery. I submitted the paperwork for 6 weeks of leave, which was the minimum recovery time my doctor expected. I only saw my department head once between giving notice of my leave and actually going on it. I was at the printer when she approached me, all fake concern and corporate speak. She mentioned hearing about my upcoming surgery and said she was glad I was taking care of myself. The hypocrisy was unbelievable. I had prepared for this moment, knowing she would say something infuriating. I replied that taking care of myself was exactly what I had been trying to do. I reminded her that I had been explicit about how working in the office aggravated my injury and how the insistence that I be there 3 days a week had accelerated my need for surgery. Her face froze in that fake smile as I continued. I explained that my doctor initially thought we could avoid surgery altogether with proper accommodations. Now I would be out for 6 weeks minimum, possibly longer depending on how recovery went. She stammered that they had followed the proper accommodation procedures. I cut her off, pointing out that now the department would have to handle my complete absence for at least 6 weeks instead of just having me remote for 1 additional day each week. I told her she would find out what a real undue burden looks like. I walked away, leaving her standing there with her mouth open. Later that day, I received an email from Human Resources asking if we could revisit my accommodation request when I returned from leave. Apparently, my department head had suddenly realized that having me work remotely was better than not having me work at all. The surgery went well, but recovery has been slow. I'm 4 weeks in now, and I've heard through co-workers that my department is struggling with my workload. They've had to distribute it among 3 different people, none of whom are familiar with my clients or processes. I've been thinking a lot during my recovery time. When I go back, I'll have a new accommodation letter from my doctor, and this time, I won't be accepting any compromises that put my health at risk. And if they try to pull the undue burden card again, I have several employment lawyers who would be very interested in taking my case. I met my wife when we were both 29. What I didn't know was that I wasn't just getting her, I was getting her mother too. A package deal I hadn't signed up for. From the beginning, her mother was everywhere. She had a key to my wife's apartment, which quickly became our apartment. She would show up unannounced, at least once a week. She'd walk in like she owned the place, which I guess in her mind she did. She would tell my wife how she should organize the fridge differently, already moving our food around without permission. My wife would explain that she had been organizing it her way for years, but her mother would dismiss this, insisting her way was better, and my wife would just let it happen. Years of conditioning had taught her that resistance was futile. Her mother treated her like she was still a teenager, not a grown woman with a career and a relationship. After a few months of this invasion, I suggested to my wife that maybe we should consider setting some boundaries. My wife defended her mother, saying she meant well. I questioned if it wasn't too much, pointing out that we never knew when she might show up uninvited. Eventually, my wife agreed to see a therapist. The therapist helped her see that this relationship wasn't healthy. Slowly, my wife started to set boundaries. First, we asked for the key back. Her mother acted like we had asked for one of her kidneys. She dramatically questioned what would happen in emergencies. My wife explained that we would call if we needed help, but that we needed our privacy. Next, we limited visits to once every 2 weeks by invitation only. This was met with tears and guilt trips, but we didn't budge. The boundaries were working, but her mother wasn't going down without a fight. She started making passive-aggressive comments every time she visited. She would express concern about potential problems, noting that she wouldn't be able to help without a key. Or she would criticize our wall colors, suggesting they clashed with the kitchen cabinets. Then came the incident that broke me. We had just finished a hellish week at work. All we wanted was to crash on the couch, but her mother called, saying she was in the neighborhood. My wife couldn't quite say no. During her visit, she used our bathroom. When I went in after her, I noticed she had flipped the orientation of our toilet paper roll. It might sound small, but to me, it represented everything that was wrong with our relationship. What kind of person enters someone else's home and changes how they have their toilet paper? I didn't say anything that day, but I made a decision. The next time we visited her house, I went to each bathroom and flipped her toilet paper rolls. It's been almost 15 years now. We've set more boundaries since then. Her mother is still in our lives, but she is nowhere near as invasive as she once was. But one thing has never changed. Every single time we visit, I flip every single toilet paper roll in her house. She's never mentioned it. Not once. And I've never been caught. She's never touched our toilet paper orientation again since that day. It's a small victory, a petty rebellion against years of boundary violations. But it's my victory, and I intend to keep winning it until one of us is dead. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.